My fiancé demanded a strict prenup to protect his future assets, or the wedding was off. I signed it without hesitation. 2 years later, I won the $10 million jackpot. When he asked for a share, I pointed to the clause he wrote. His lawyer was speechless. The prenup was his idea, but the clause that ended everything, that was his too. I want to be clear about that before I say anything else, because when people hear this story, they assume I was clever from the beginning, that I had some plan, that I saw what was coming and positioned myself carefully. I didn't. I was just a woman who read what she signed and then remembered it 2 years later when it mattered. That's it. That's the whole thing. But the details are worth understanding because they tell you something about how a person can sit across from you every single day and never actually see you. Marcus and I met at a friend's birthday dinner in the fall at one of those restaurants where the lighting is so dim you feel like you're being told a secret just by walking in. He was charming in that specific way that feels personal when you're on the receiving end of it, the kind of charm that makes you feel chosen rather than targeted. He asked thoughtful questions. He laughed at the right moments. He texted 2 days later, which was enough time to seem intentional, but not so long that it felt strategic. I noticed all of these things and I thought, this one is careful. I meant it as a compliment at the time. We dated for about 14 months before he proposed. The proposal itself was private, low-key, just the two of us at a restaurant we'd been to on our second date, and I remember thinking that was a lovely detail, that he had remembered, that he had planned something around a memory we shared. What I understand now is that the private setting was also efficient. No witnesses, no crowd, no moment where I might have paused and looked at the faces of people who knew me and felt a flicker of doubt. Not that I had reason for doubt at that point. I'm just saying the quietness of it served more than one purpose, whether he knew it or not. The prenup conversation came about 3 weeks after the engagement. He brought it up on a Sunday morning in that half-awake window of time when the coffee is still brewing and nothing feels quite real yet. He said he'd been thinking about it. He said his lawyer had recommended it. He said it wasn't about trust, it was just practical because he was building something. His consulting firm was growing, he had investments, he had ambitions, and he wanted to make sure that both of us were protected in the event that things ever went wrong. He said both of us liked that. He emphasized it, actually, like the prenup was a favor he was doing for the both of us. I didn't argue. I asked if I could read it before I agreed to anything. He said, of course, looked slightly surprised that I'd asked, and said his lawyer would send over a draft by the end of the week. What I remember about the weeks that followed is that he was very confident about how this would go. Not hostile, not pressuring, just certain. He talked about it the way you talk about a formality, something that had to be done but would obviously get done without difficulty because everyone was reasonable and it all made sense. He brought up stories of couples he knew who'd had prenups and called it the most mature decision they ever made. He mentioned a statistic about financial conflict being one of the leading causes of divorce. He said things that were technically accurate and practically designed to move me toward a specific conclusion. And the whole time he said them, he was so pleasant about it, so measured, that I kept thinking, he just wants this to feel normal. That's all. He just wants me to be comfortable. He was also the first one to say, gently but clearly, that the wedding couldn't move forward without it. He didn't say it as a threat. He said it the way you tell someone about a house rule. Not aggressive, just firm. This is how it has to be. He smiled when he said it, which made it harder to identify as a boundary and easier to absorb as just a preference. The draft came. I read it alone at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold while I was working through it. The document was thorough. Everything Marcus had built before the marriage, his company, his investments, his savings, his properties, would remain entirely his in the event of a divorce. Any growth in those assets during the marriage would also remain his, regardless of the nature of our partnership, regardless of what I contributed or didn't contribute. My own assets were similarly ring-fenced, which was generous of the document to offer since I had significantly less to protect. I was working in nonprofit consulting at the time, which is the kind of work that tells you a lot about a person's priorities and almost nothing about their earning potential. Buried in Section 7, worded in that particular way that legal documents word things when they're trying to be thorough rather than notable. was a
why am
clause
I
about
always the one
independent
who ends
financial
it?
acquisitions.
I did not have a
It
good
said in
answer.
summary that any
And the
financial
longer I
gains made
sat with the
independently
question,
by either
the more
party,
clearly I
from
could see
sources
what had been
outside the
true
marriage
all
and
along,
unrelated to
but what I
marital
had been
assets
too
or
afraid
labor,
to look at
would
directly.
remain the sole
The
property of the
silence was not
acquiring
David in
individual,
pain.
not to be
It was
divided or
not David
claimed by
struggling
the
to
other.
find his words.
I read it
It
twice.
was David
Then I
in
read the
control,
surrounding paragraphs
using
to
the
make
one
sure I
tool that
understood
had
the
consistently
context
worked on
correctly.
me,
I
knowing from
did.
years of
I had a
experience
consultation
that I
with
would
my own
eventually
lawyer,
come back
a
to him
woman my mother
and
had
take the
used years
blame
ago
and
for her
restore the
estate
peace.
planning, quiet and
It was not a
precise,
reaction.
and not given to
It was a
unnecessary
strategy.
commentary. She walked
By
me
day
through each
6, I had
section.
stopped reaching.
When we
I
got to
stopped
Clause
making
7, she
gestures.
paused for a moment and
I
said it
moved
was
through our
unusual for a
home
clause
doing what
like
I
that to
needed
be
to
worded
do,
so
existing in my
definitively
own
that
space
most prenups
without
made some
performing any
provision for
version of
shared gains,
remorse for
even
something
on
I had
separate
not done
ventures.
wrong.
She said
And
it
I
seemed
watched to see
designed
what
specifically
happened
to
when I
shield
stopped giving
Marcus's
him
side of the
what the
ledger.
silence was
She asked if
designed
I
to
understood
extract
what I'd
from
be
me.
agreeing to.
What
I said I
happened was
did.
that
I said I
nothing
wanted to
changed on
sign
his
it.
end. And
She
that
gave me a
stillness on
look,
his
not
end
unkind,
told me
just
more about
measured,
the truth of
and
our
made a note that I
dynamic
had been
than
fully
anything he
counseled.
had ever said out
Then she
loud.
countersigned the
On day
consultation
7,
form and
I
wished
called
me
my
well.
sister. On
I
day
never
8,
told
I
Marcus that
started
I'd
to
had
think
it
about what I
reviewed.
was going to do
He assumed
next.
I'd skimmed it,
I packed
or
carefully
perhaps that I'd
and
trusted
without
him enough
rushing
not to
because I
look
was
too
not leaving
closely,
in a
which was a
panic, and I
distinction
did
that
not
didn't
want it
seem
to look
important
like
to
I
him at
was.
the time.
I took enough
He
for
was
2
visibly
weeks, my
relieved when I
clothes, my
brought the
books,
signed
my
document to the
laptop,
table,
and the
and his
small
relief was
framed
real.
photograph I kept
He
on
didn't
my
try to hide it,
nightstand.
didn't
The
soften
one
it
of
into
me and my
something that looked
sister
more like
laughing somewhere
affection.
by the water,
He said,
both
"I
of us
knew you'd
looking
understand,"
completely
and squeezed
unbothered
my
by the
hand
world.
across the table.
I took
And I
that
smiled and
photo
said, "Of
because I
course."
needed something to
We were married
remind
the
me
following
of what
spring.
my own face
Small
looked like
ceremony,
when it
maybe
belonged
60 guests,
entirely to
outdoor
me.
venue, the
David
kind
was
of
in the
day that
living room
photographs
when I
beautifully
carried
and
my
ends with
bag to the
everyone
front door.
slightly sunburned
He
and
looked at the
genuinely
bag and
happy.
then he looked at me.
I was
And for
happy.
the first time in
I
10
want to be
days,
honest
he
about
actually
that.
opened his mouth.
There were no red
He
flags
asked
waving
what I
that
was
day,
doing,
no intuition
not
telling
with
me
any
I'd made a
softness in it,
mistake,
not with
no
the voice of
moment
a
of private
man who was
clarity where
afraid
I
of what
saw the
the answer
future
might
and felt
be,
afraid.
but flatly.
I was
The
simply
way
a
you
woman
ask
who had
someone
married
why they
someone she
moved
believed she
furniture without
loved,
checking with you
had signed a
first.
document she had fully
I
read,
told
and was
him I
moving
was
into a
giving him
life
the
that
space
looked,
he had clearly
from every
decided he
visible
needed.
angle, like
He did
exactly
not
what
say
she'd hoped
anything
for.
after that.
The first
I
year
went to the
was good,
kitchen and I
mostly.
wrote the note.
We settled
I
into
had
the
been
rhythms
thinking
of
about
shared
what to
life.
put in it since day 8.
The little
And in the
negotiations
end,
over
I kept it
routines,
simple,
the
because
figuring out of
simple
how
was the
two
only
different
thing that
systems of
felt
doing
true.
things can
I
coexist in
wrote
the
that
same
10
kitchen,
days of
the same
silence had told me
schedule, the
more
same
about our
bed.
marriage than 7
Marcus
years
worked
of
long hours,
conversation,
which I'd
and that I
expected.
was not
His
leaving
firm
because
was
I was
growing.
angry,
He
but
traveled
because I
occasionally
needed to
for client
exist
meetings.
somewhere. I was
I
not being
continued my
punished
own
for
work,
having a
which
voice.
took me through a cycle
I
of
told
grant
him I hoped he
applications
would
and
sit with
program
that while I was
evaluations,
gone.
and long
I
days
folded
that
the
paid
paper and
modestly
left it
and
next to
felt
his keys
privately
on the
more
counter,
meaningful than I
picked up my
sometimes admitted.
bag, and walked out.
There were things I
The door
noticed,
closed
though,
behind me, and
small
the
things
sound
that
of
I
it was the
cataloged without
quietest
really
and most
meaning
honest
to,
thing that had
the way you
happened
make a
between us
mental
in
note of
years.
something without deciding
My
whether it
sister
matters
had the
yet.
guest room ready
He
before I
managed all
even
the shared
arrived,
finances,
because
which
she
had
had
seemed
heard
like a
something in
kindness
my
at
voice on
first.
the phone 2
He
days
liked
earlier,
systems,
and she
was
already
good with
understood what
spreadsheets,
was
had a
coming.
level of financial
I
literacy
stayed
that I
for nearly
genuinely
2 weeks,
respected.
and those
But I
days were
noticed
not
that when I
dramatic
asked
or
questions about
filled
our
with any kind
accounts,
of grand
the answers were
revelation.
always slightly more
They were
complex
simply
than the
quiet in
question
a way
warranted.
that felt like relief,
Not wrong,
rather
not
than
evasive
punishment.
exactly, just
I slept through the night.
elaborate.
I ate what I
Like a
actually
simple
wanted to
question
eat.
about a shared
I
savings
sat with my
balance would
own
become an
thoughts without
explanation of
having to
investment
calculate
vehicles and
how my
liquidity
presence was
timelines and the
landing on
logic of
someone
keeping
else.
certain
And
funds
I slowly
separated for tax
remembered what it felt
purposes.
like to take up
I
space
always came
without
away from those
apology.
conversations with less
David
clarity
sent a
than I'd
message
started
on the
with,
second day
and I started to
asking
notice
when I
that
was
I always
coming
came
home.
away from them feeling
There
like
was
I'd
no
asked
mention
something
of the
slightly
note,
naive,
no
something slightly
acknowledgement of the
beneath
10
what he'd
days,
expected of
or
me.
what they meant,
He
or
was
what I
also
might
very
have been feeling
interested in
through
what I
all
was
of them.
doing, but
Just
in
an
a specific way.
expectation, direct
Less,
and
how was your day,
uncomplicated,
and more,
that
what's your
wherever I
plan?
had gone, I was
What's your
still
plan for the
orbiting
career?
him,
What's the
and would
ceiling in your
return when the
field?
distance silence felt like
Have you
enough of
thought about a
statement.
pivot? Have you
I
thought
did
about
not
something
reply
with
for
better
3
returns
days.
on your time?
When I did, I
He
told
asked
him I
these
would
things
come
with
back
what looked like
when we could have
support,
an honest
but they had the
conversation
texture
about
of
what had been
assessment,
happening
and
in
I
our
didn't quite
marriage.
know what to do
And I
with
meant
that.
it as plainly as it
There
sounds.
was a moment, maybe 8
He
months
called
into the
that
marriage,
evening,
when a
and I let it
colleague of
ring.
mine was offered a
He called the
significant grant
following
for a
morning,
project
and
we'd
I
worked
let
on
that one ring
together.
too.
She
On
called
the
me
3rd day,
first,
he called,
excited,
and I
and we spent an
answered.
hour on the
And the
phone
voice
working
on
through
the
how to
other
structure
end
the team
was
around
one
it.
I genuinely had
When I
not
told
heard
Marcus about
before.
it that evening, his first
Uncertain in
question
a
was
way
whether
that
my
his
name was on the
silence
grant
had never allowed
application.
him to be.
I said no,
Stripped
I
of the
wasn't the
quiet
lead, I was a
authority
supporting
that years
researcher.
of my
He
compliance had
nodded and
built up
moved
around
on,
him.
and later that evening
He
I saw him
sounded like a
searching
man who
something
had
on his
finally
laptop
understood that
and angling
something
the
he had
screen in a
taken
way that wasn't
completely
quite
for
natural,
granted
a very
was no
small
longer a
adjustment,
guarantee.
the kind you
And
don't
that
notice until you've
understanding had
already
reached him
noticed it.
in a place that nothing I
I
had
didn't
ever
ask
said
what he'd been
directly
looking at, I
had
told myself
managed
I
to
was being
reach.
paranoid.
We talked for a
What I
long
didn't
time
tell
that
myself,
night.
but quietly
He did
understood,
not
was
have
that he was
clean
doing a
or
kind of
fully
math
formed
about me
words
that
for
had nothing to
everything,
do with love.
and neither did I.
The
but we
lottery
were
ticket
both
was an
present in the
accident. That sounds like
conversation
something
in a
people
way we
say
had
when
not
they
been
want a
in
better
years.
story, but it's
Neither of
true.
us shutting down.
I was at a
Neither
gas
of us
station buying a
retreating.
bottle of water
Both of
after a
us sitting
long
inside
drive
the
back from a
discomfort
site visit
instead of
3
reaching
counties
for the
away,
exit.
and the woman behind the
He
counter had
acknowledged
just
that the
finished
silence
explaining
had
the
been a
current
way of
jackpot to the
managing the
man
situation,
ahead of me
and I
in line, and when
acknowledged that
she
I had
looked at me
allowed
and
it to
asked if
work
I
for
wanted
so
one,
long that I had
something
gradually
about the
become
whole scene,
someone
the late
I no
afternoon
longer
light,
fully
the exhaustion in my
recognized,
shoulders,
a woman
the
who
way
had
the
learned to
day had been
shrink at
long
the
and
first
ordinary,
sign of his
made me
withdrawal
say
and
yes.
call that love.
I bought one ticket.
We were
I
not
put it in my
repaired
coat
in that
pocket
one
and forgot about it
conversation,
until
and
5
I will
days
not
later when I
pretend
was cleaning out
otherwise.
pockets before doing
But
laundry.
something that had been
I
sealed
checked it
shut
standing
for
in
a
the
very
laundry room
long
on my
time had
phone in 30
opened,
seconds.
and that
Then I
opening
checked
was
it
where
again.
everything that came
Then I
after
sat down
became
on the floor of
possible.
the laundry room on
I
the
had
cold
spent 7
tile and
years
I stayed
afraid
there
of
for a
David's
while.
silence. What I did not
Ten
know
million
until
two
I
hundred and
finally
twelve
stopped
thousand
running from
dollars.
it was
The
that the
first
most
thing I
powerful
did,
thing I ever
and I
did
want you to
was
understand
become the
this was
woman
not
he was afraid
calculated,
of
it was
losing.
instinct, it was
If
something
you
that
made
moved
it
through
all the
me
way
before
to
I
the
had
end of this
language for it.
story, then you already
Was
know
not
it was
tell
about much
Marcus.
more than a note
I
left
don't
on
know
a
how to
kitchen
explain
counter.
that except to say that
It was
something
about the
inside
moment
me
a woman
understood the
stopped shrinking
situation before my
and
mind
started
caught up to the
remembering who
reasoning.
she was before she
The
learned
way
to make
animals
herself
go
small.
still before they process
If
the
this
threat.
story hit something
I
real
just
for
went
you,
still.
share it with
I
someone who
sat on
needs
that
to hear
laundry
it
room
today.
floor and I thought about
And if you want
Clause
more
7 in the
stories like
prenup.
this one, every
I thought
single
about it the
week,
way you think about
subscribe
something
and
you
turn
filed
on the
away
bell
carefully
so you
without
never
knowing
miss one.
why.
I will see
Any
you in the next
financial gains
story.
made independently by either party, either from sources outside the marriage and unrelated to marital assets or labor, shall remain the sole property of the acquiring individual. I had bought the ticket alone, with my own money, at a gas station 3 counties away after a work trip taken in my own car. The ticket was in my coat pocket, in my name, in a transaction connected to no shared account, no shared card, no marital anything. I called my lawyer, not Marcus's lawyer, not a shared lawyer, my own, the same woman who had reviewed the prenup. I called her personal cell because her assistant was already gone for the day, and I apologized for the hour, and she said, "Don't apologize, just talk." I talked. She was quiet for a moment afterward, and then she said, "I remember Clause 7. I said I remembered it too. She said I needed to come in first thing in the morning, and I needed to bring documentation of everything, the ticket, the receipt, the date, the method of purchase, and I needed to do it before I said a word to anyone else. I said I understood. She said my name one more time. Clearly, the way people say your name when they want you to feel the weight of what they're telling you. Do not tell him. I didn't. The days that followed were the strangest of my life because they were completely ordinary. I made dinner, I asked about his client calls, I folded laundry, I responded to emails. I slept on my side of the bed and I breathed evenly, and I did not once let anything show on my face that would have given him a reason to look closer. This is something I only understood later about myself, that I have an extraordinary capacity for stillness. I had spent 2 years in a marriage where I was often being quietly assessed, and what that does if you survive it with any sense of self intact is it teaches you to move without being tracked. My lawyer moved fast. She had contacts in lottery legal advising. This is more common than people realize. There's an entire ecosystem of professionals who exist for exactly this kind of situation. And within 48 hours, I had a legal team in place. I had begun the claims process in a way that documented the independence of the acquisition at every step. The ticket was verified, the timeline was clean, the clause was clear. On the 3rd day, I called my sister. I had not spoken to her in any meaningful way about my marriage. Not the real parts, not the parts I had cataloged in that quiet, ongoing way. She is the kind of person who listens without interrupting and responds without flinching, which is a rare combination and the reason I called her and not anyone else. I told her everything. The prenup, the clause, the ticket, the 48 hours of laundry and dinner and sleeping on my side of the bed. She was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "What do you want to do?" Not what are you going to do? What do you want to do? I said I wanted to finish what had already started. I said I wanted to understand exactly where I stood before I made any decisions. I said that what I did not want was to make a move that cost me more than it gained me just because I was emotional about it. She said that was the most clear-headed thing she'd ever heard anyone say in the middle of something like this. That conversation settled something in me that had been quietly unsettled for a long time. I made an appointment with a family law attorney on top of my existing team. I wanted to understand my options fully, not impulsively, just fully. She walked me through the landscape carefully. Given the prenup, given the clause, given the documented independence of the acquisition, The lottery winnings were mine under the terms of the agreement he had written. She said she would not predict what he might attempt, but she said that in her experience, when someone has signed a document without fully imagining the scenario it would one day govern, they tend to become creative about interpretation once the stakes are real. She was right. I told Marcus 2 weeks after I found out. I chose a Tuesday evening, midweek, no particular occasion, no atmosphere that could later be recalled as confrontational or dramatic. I told him calmly in the kitchen while we were both still standing. I said I had something to share. I said I had won the lottery, that the ticket was a single purchase I'd made on my way back from a work trip, that the winnings had been verified and the claim was already in process. I told him the amount. He was very still for a moment. Then he smiled, that same smile he'd had when I brought back the signed prenup. The one that was more relief than happiness. The one that was really just an assessment landing favorably. He said, "We should celebrate." He said it like we were already talking about what that would look like. I said, "I should be clear that the winnings are mine individually under the terms of the prenup." The smile stayed on his face for a second longer than it should have, like it hadn't gotten the message yet. Then it went away. He said he wasn't sure that was how it worked. He said it was our marriage, that the whole point of a marriage was partnership, that whatever either of us gained benefited both of us. He said the prenup was designed to protect his business assets, not to create a situation like this. He said that surely I understood that. I said I understood the prenup quite well. I said I had read it carefully before I signed it and had kept a copy, which was true. I said Clause 7 was clear in its language. I said I wasn't making an interpretation. I was describing what the document actually said. He said he thought we should talk to his lawyer. I said that was completely his right. I was calm for all of this. I want to be precise about that, because calmness here was not a strategy. It was the natural result of having had 2 weeks to feel everything I needed to feel in private, alone, on that laundry room floor, and on quiet walks and in conversations with my sister and my legal team. By the time I was standing in the kitchen telling him, I had already moved through everything that needed to be moved through, and what was left was just clarity. His lawyer called mine the following week. My understanding is that the conversation did not go smoothly for them. My lawyer told me afterward that the opposing counsel had raised several arguments, each of which was walked back by the language of their own client's document. The clause had been written broadly, precisely, and without ambiguity. It did not require mutual agreement. It did not contain a provision for unexpected independent acquisitions. It said what it said in the words they had chosen, and it meant what it meant. My lawyer said the phrase that stayed with her was when opposing counsel went quiet mid-argument, apparently reviewing the document again in real time, and there was a long pause before she said, "I see." Just that, I see, I wasn't in that room. But I have thought about that pause many times since. There were a few weeks of friction after that, the kind you expect when something irrevocable is becoming clear, and the person on the other end of it hasn't fully accepted it yet. Marcus tried several approaches. He tried warmth first, renewed affection, conversations about our future, what we could do together with resources like this, where we could travel, what we could build. I listened to all of it and felt something I can only describe as a kind of grief. Not for him exactly, but for the version of him I'd chosen to believe in. The one who'd remembered the restaurant from our second date and meant it as a gesture of love rather than a careful piece of choreography. Then he tried logic. He built a case for why the spirit of the prenup was different from the letter. He talked about intent. He talked about fairness. He was articulate and measured and reasonable sounding, and I sat across from him and thought about every conversation we'd had about my work, every slightly elaborate answer to a simple financial question, every moment where I had wondered whether I was being loved or being managed, and I thought, I know what intent looks like. This isn't it. Then he tried the marriage itself. He said we shouldn't let a document tear apart something real. He said he'd never intended for the prenup to apply to something like this. He said he loved me. He said it like a card he was placing on the table. Measured and timed. I said I believed that he believed that. He asked what that meant. I said it meant exactly what I'd said. That was the last real conversation we had about the money. His lawyer made one more formal attempt, a letter arguing that the lottery winnings should be considered marital property on the basis of several points of law that my team addressed one by one, with patience and without drama. The response was thorough. The clause stood. The documentation of independent acquisition was clean. There was no legal pathway to what he was asking for. The divorce was filed shortly afterward. I will not pretend it was emotionally simple because endings rarely are, even when they're right. But I will say that it was procedurally straightforward, given the prenup, given that he had, in his care for protecting his own side of the ledger, been very precise about which things were mine and which were his. His firm was his investments were his future assets, the ones he'd been so careful to define and shelter, those were his. And the winnings I had acquired independently from a ticket I bought alone with my own money at a gas station 3 counties from our shared home, those were mine. Clause 7, Section 7, his words, his lawyer, his idea. I think about the version of him that sat at that table and explained the prenup to me on a Sunday morning with the coffee still brewing. I think about how certain he was that I would sign it without fully reading it. I think about his lawyer drafting that document with the specific goal of protecting Marcus from every scenario they could imagine, and how thoroughly they failed to imagine me. How thoroughly they both failed to imagine what it looks like when you underestimate a quiet person and she simply reads. I didn't celebrate in any particular way when it was over. No bottle of champagne, no dinner out, no moment of visible triumph. I sat in my new apartment, small, mine, extraordinarily quiet, with a cup of tea and a stack of paperwork that confirmed something it would take me a while to fully absorb. I thought about my lawyer's face when I'd first called her. I thought about my sister's voice asking me what I wanted, not what I was going to do. I thought about the laundry room floor and the way I'd just gone still. What I understand now is that stillness was never passivity. It was always just the space between knowing and acting. I've thought about what I would tell someone in a version of that situation. Sitting across from someone who loves the idea of you but has never actually looked at you, who writes documents designed to account for every version of the future except the one where you turn out to be the most important variable in the room. I would tell them to read everything, to ask for time and use it, to understand that the instinct to go quiet is not weakness. Sometimes it is the sharpest thing you have. I would tell them that people who underestimate you will often build the very structure that undoes them, because their miscalculation about you runs all the way through. He was so sure he'd protected himself. He had, just not from the right direction. The morning after the settlement was finalized, I woke up earlier than I needed to and lay in the quiet for a while. The apartment had that particular stillness that new spaces have before they've accumulated your sounds and your habits and your rhythms. Light came through the curtains in a way I hadn't fully seen before, because I was usually still asleep at that hour or already moving. I just lay there and let the morning be what it was. Then I got up and made coffee and sat at my own table and opened my laptop and started looking at the grant applications I'd been meaning to finish. The work was the same as it had always been. The numbers in the background were different, but the work was the same, and I was glad for that. Some things, I thought, you keep exactly as they are. Not because you have to, but because they're yours in a way that has nothing to do with money, nothing to do with anyone else, nothing to do with a document or a clause or a long pause on the other end of a lawyer's phone call. That felt like the right place to land. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment below. I read every single one.